The Waffen-SS was the elite of the German army during the Second World War, with a reputation for carrying out extremely audacious operations. The armed forces of the SS were present from the invasion of Poland until the fall of Berlin to the Red Army. Accused of committing countless war crimes, the men of the Waffen-SS were branded as criminals and condemned to a bitter fate at the end of the conflict. Today, followers, we will see what happened to these men after the fall of the Third Reich. After the defeat in Normandy and the Soviet offensive of 1944, the SS tried to delay the inevitable by fighting until the end. The SS fought with fanaticism, convinced that they were true super soldiers. They died by the thousands, neither giving nor asking for mercy. The average life expectancy for a Waffen-SS soldier on the front was 2 months. After defeating the Allies in Arnhem, their last significant action would be during the final offensive of the Reich, the Battle of the Bulge. In this battle stood out the special commands led by Otto Sini, who acted in the rear guard of the American army, creating tremendous chaos, and the K Group of Piper, who advanced further than anyone on the American front. In 1945, most of the German units fought not only to resist the Soviets a little longer, but also for simple survival. In mid-March 1945, the Germans formed elements of several SS units into a combat group to defend the Hungarian village of Sword from a Soviet attack. Hans Jendorf, an officer of the Sturshut Battalion of the 3rd SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf witnessed the futile struggle of his SS soldiers, who ran out of ammunition for their weapons. The SS soldiers resorted to knives and trench tools to defend themselves. The Soviet forces offered the Germans the opportunity to surrender, but they rejected the offer and the Russians attacked forcefully. Communist soldiers advanced, supported by heavy Soviet tanks. A reconstituted battalion of the Nordland Division, which had later joined the Viking Division, accompanied the assault, while the Soviets surrounded the German units in the nearby city of Schulenburg. The morale of the Viking Division began to break. Oberst Karl Ulrich decided to save his division from destruction and ordered his troops to break the siege on March 22nd against Hitler's policy that the German forces should not give ground. Another German SS division, the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, fought to keep an escape corridor open for the Viking troops. Hitler burst into anger when he learned of the withdrawal of Würm and the SS units. 5 days later, he ordered the men of the Hohenstaufen Division to remove the distinctive armbands that indicated they belonged to an elite division. The death sentence of Nazi Germany sounded in Berlin, trapped between the Allied armies that advanced from the east and west. Many remaining SS units received the order to head to Berlin to participate in what would be the final battle. At that time, practically all the German units were a shadow of what they had been, decimated in men and short of weapons, equipment, and fuel. The divisions were reduced to battalions, but in spite of everything, the SS continued fighting. The ties between their soldiers, forged by years of fighting side by side, kept them firm. This was true for both native Germans and foreign SS soldiers. They were determined to fight to the end, largely because they had nowhere else to go. Returning home was not an option, and being captured by the Soviets meant almost certain death. Even in the last desperate days, the idea of surrendering their weapons was unthinkable, according to an SS soldier. Some men of the Waffen-SS still believed in the possibility of victory, even when the war was only a few weeks from its end, trusting in the promises of innovative weapons. We knew that important things were happening, that incredible weapons would soon enter into action, and that, thanks to them, the war would change completely, expressed Erik Wallin, a Swedish man of the Nordland Division. We were aware that even better things were coming. The forces of the Red Army that advanced towards Berlin found a unique way to commemorate April 20th, 1945. They celebrated the occasion by bombing the center of Berlin with their long-range artillery. 2 days later, Hitler burst into one of his last rages when the 11th SS Panzer Army, created in the last weeks of the war by Himmler, did not fulfill an attack order. It is believed that Hitler's outburst was because the SS, in whom he believed blindly, had failed him for the first time. However, Several SS units that had not deserted remained in the city, including the remains of the Nordland and Charlemagne divisions, determined to fight to the end. In 1945, the SS began to disintegrate, and some officers hoped to take advantage of the tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union to enter into separate peace negotiations with the Western Allies that would allow the National Socialist state to survive and continue the fight against the Soviet Union. Among these officers were Obergruppenführer Karl Wolff, the highest-ranking SS leader in German-occupied Italy, General Ernst Kaltenbrunner, successor of Heydrich as head of the main security office of the Reich, Walter Schellenberg, head of Department 6 of the SD, and even Himmler himself, who seemed increasingly worried when the SS men considered the possibility of surrendering. They were in a difficult situation. They lacked the necessary power and a clear idea of what life would be like after the Nazi regime to accept the total surrender, even before the firm demands of the Western Allies. Surrender and fate. Karl Wolff managed to persuade the German military authorities of northern Italy to surrender to the Anglo-Americans on May 2, 1945, 5 days before the end of the war. At the end of April, Himmler himself made an offer of unconditional surrender through an intermediary to General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe. Hitler learned of the offer by radio on April 29, 1945. In one of his last official acts, the German leader ordered that Himmler be stripped of all his ranks and positions on May 6, 1945. Hitler's successor as president of the Reich, Admiral Karl Dönitz, had previously relieved Himmler of his functions following Hitler's orders, despite his promise to all the SS men to assume all responsibility for their acts. The former head of the SS planned to disappear dressed in a secret police uniform and carrying documents under the name of Heinrich Hitzinger. On May 20th, Soviet troops captured Hitzinger and handed him over to the British, to whom Himmler then confessed his true identity. While his captors were trying to register him, Himmler escaped by biting into a cyanide capsule. After the fall of the Third Reich and the death of Führer Heinrich Himmler, the SS soldiers faced a brutal fate, immersed in the uncertainty of a future marked by defeat. These elite warriors were persecuted by the Allies. The soldiers of the Waffen-SS returned home on foot. At that time, the railroads were almost totally destroyed, the roads had little asphalt, and the rivers had to be crossed by swimming because the bridges had been bombed. With few farmers' carts available, many German soldiers returned from Belgica, Francia, Italia, and the Países Bajos, hoping their families were alive in the countryside, since the cities were devastated by Allied bombings. Many were shot without warning. The SS had a reputation for not taking prisoners and discouraging surrender. In the last stages of the war, numerous SS divisions attempted to surrender to the Western Allies, who were more willing to take them prisoner and generally avoided execution after processing. However, it was known that the Allies, both American and British, sometimes killed German soldiers who tried to surrender, regardless of whether they were SS or not. They avoided surrendering to the Poles, French, and, curiously, the Canadians. It was observed that the Canadians only took SS prisoners if specifically ordered to do so, and it seems those orders had to be reiterated. Normandy had made the Canadians very ruthless toward the SS. In contrast, the Soviets often summarily executed those who attempted to surrender, and if they managed to surrender successfully, their chances of survival were generally low, as were those for any soldier or civilian captured by the Russians. When captured by the Western Allies, some of these divisions were returned to their country of origin or handed over to the Russians, especially if they had served extensively on the Eastern Front. Depending on their country of origin, some faced execution, while others were received as heroes for fighting communism or simply ignored. Those who were handed over to the Russians often faced execution or forced labor, and there were cases in which the Soviets killed entire divisions of the Waffen-SS that had surrendered. In some cases, the number of survivors from these divisions after surrender was in the single digits. Most of these men had the SS tattoo in their blood, and the Allies knew it. It was basically just a tattoo of their blood type. The Americans made all the German POWs march in single file, shirtless, and with their arms raised. If they saw a blood-type tattoo, they separated them. Some SS members went to the extreme of cutting their skin and using makeup to cover up the tattoo. The Americans were provided with pamphlets on how the Germans tried to hide these tattoos when captured. They were identified and interrogated. If it was a lower rank who had enlisted in 1943, they were sent to a prisoner camp and subsequently released. The SS began recruiting soldiers in 1943, so some men really had no other option and were compensated with pensions. If it was a high-ranking SS officer, they were interrogated and sent to a prisoner camp or executed after capture. They were stripped of their ranks, as they were not soldiers, but low-ranking SS soldiers had many hopes of surviving, especially if their documentation had been destroyed, since the personnel offices destroyed much of the evidence that could be used against them from 1944 onwards, including documents indicating who belonged to the SS and the year they joined. Despite their crimes, the SS would be treated fairly by the Western Allies, which is what they sought when all hope was lost. However, the Soviets did not use a fair judicial system like that of the Western Allies. In fact, much of the SS personnel, and marked with the VE, was sent to Soviet custody, and were never heard from again. To this day, some SS members are still missing. They simply vanished. The Soviets locked them up in gulags, and they could be released or stay there forever. The trials and the post-war with Himmler and Heydrich dead, the victorious Allies chose Ernst Kaltenbrunner, successor to Heydrich, as head of the Reich Main Security Office to represent the SS and all its crimes in the trial of the main war criminals in Nuremberg, which began in November 1945. The court prosecutors also collectively accused and convicted the SS and the Gestapo as criminal organizations. The leaders of three key SS organizations, the Concentration Camp Administration, the Einsatzgruppen, and Himmler's Reich Commissariat for the Strengthening of German Nationhood, were tried in 3 subsequent trials in Nuremberg under the auspices of the International Military Tribunal. Each of the victorious Allied powers and each of the governments reconstituted after liberation from German occupation tried hundreds of mid- and low-ranking SS officers, although SS members continued to be tried in the Federal Republic of Germany and elsewhere after the end of World War II. Even to this day, the vast majority of SS and police members were never held accountable for their crimes. Following the execution of Kaltenbrunner on October 16, 1946, the fate of senior SS officials varied greatly. Some were tried and executed, such as Oberfuhrer Fritz Klein. Others were captured but died of natural causes before trial, such as Oberfuhrer Oskar Danger. Many were charged with war crimes and spent time in prison, such as Brigadefuhrer Kurt Meyer. Beyond the formation process of the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal, the occupying forces, including the United States, also conducted individual military tribunals in their respective zones. The trials, presided over by the United States Army, took place in Dachau between November 1945 and December 1947. The defendants included a wide range of people, from senior German army commanders and Nazi officials to concentration camp personnel and civilians. They were charged with war crimes against Allied prisoners of war and crimes perpetrated against civilians and Allied prisoners of war in concentration camps, including Dachau. As part of the Dachau trials, the trial for the Malmedy massacre was held for 2 months, from May to July 1946, and focused on the crimes of the Waffen-SS against American prisoners of war and Belgian civilians. The Malmedy massacre was a documented and publicized murder of unarmed American prisoners of war by the 1st SS Panzer Division during the Battle of the Bulge on December 17, 1944. Elements of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, under the command of Joachim Peiper, captured 113 American soldiers, gathered them in a field, and machine-gunned them. Some survived by burying themselves under their companions or playing dead, but 84 American prisoners of war were killed. In the 1946 trial, 74 SS members, including Joachim Peiper and Joseph Dietrich, were charged with crimes. These men were arrested in various places after being defeated and identified as members of units responsible for war crimes. They were interrogated in Schiphol, Germany, by American soldiers who spoke several languages and had escaped Nazi persecution. Initially, the prisoners were kept together and had the opportunity to coordinate their stories and plan their defense. The 7 survivors of Malmö testified at the trial, which began on May 16th. Belgian civilians who witnessed the murder of unarmed civilians also testified. The SS members testified under oath, and much of their statements were supported by nearly 100 testimonies presented to the court, including confessions and statements from some of the defendants that implicated their co-defendants. The defendants, dressed in uniforms, wore a numbered identification card around their necks. Only a few had the opportunity to testify. The prosecution argued that the murder of PS and other Americans perpetrated by Piper and his men was premeditated as a result of Hitler's orders to carry out a ruthless campaign to instill fear and terror. The defense argued that the killings occurred in the midst of battle. After the trials concluded, the verdict was handed down on July 16, 1946, convicting all the defendants in Dachau. An American military court of the United States sentenced 46 members of the Waffen-SS, including Joachim Piper, to death by hanging for crimes against the Allied PS. Another 23 received life sentences, and the rest, sentences of between 10 and 20 years. What happened in the months and years that followed has become a subject of interest and investigation. The process and pretrial interrogations were highly publicized, controversial, and politicized. The SS convicts claimed that American interrogators used illegal methods, including torture, and that all statements were forced. The former chief defense, Colonel Willis Everett, continued to work on behalf of the convicts even after returning to his country in 1947. After the 1946 trial, controversies arose, and a commission was formed to investigate. In 1948, some death sentences were commuted to life imprisonment, but not for Joachim Piper and others. In 1951, many were released, and the few remaining death sentences, including Piper's, were commuted in 1956. Piper and others were released from Landsberg prison years after the conflict. Former SS officers organized HIAG, an association of mutual aid of former members of the Waffen-SS. It was a pressure group and a veterans organization founded in West Germany in 1951 with the main objective of achieving the legal rehabilitation of the Waffen-SS. In 1951, Otto Kumm, a former SS brigadier, founded the HIAG, which had more than 20,000 members. The senior general of the Waffen-SS, Paul Hauer, was the spokesman for HIAG, and former commanders of the Waffen-SS, as well known as Felix Steiner and Herbert Giller, became prominent figures. Sepp Dietrich and Kurt Meyer joined after their release from prison in 1955 and 1954, respectively. Meyer became HIAG's most effective spokesman after his death in 1961. Erich Erd assumed that role. Since 1949, the ban on forming veterans associations had been lifted in October 1950. A group of former officers drafted the Himrod Memorandum, which they presented to German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. They demanded the release of the German Waffen-SS and the cessation of defamation of German soldiers, including those of the Waffen-SS. Kurt Meyer, a former commander of the Waffen-SS, published his memoirs Grenadier as part of the campaign for the rehabilitation of the SS and the glorification of their role in the war. Although HIAG achieved the rehabilitation of the Waffen-SS, its propaganda efforts contributed to reshaping the image of the Waffen-SS in popular culture. Its influence persists, and academic studies are overshadowed by a large number of amateur historical studies, memoirs of SS officers, internet forums, illustrated books, websites, and war games. HIAG also had a publishing house, Moonin Verlag, which served as a platform for its advertising objectives. Professional historians have described their work as revisionist apologetic. At its first major meeting, held in 1952 in Verdun, Hermann Bernhard Ramke, a former paratrooper, general, and convicted war criminal, condemned the Western Allies as the true war criminals and insisted that the blacklist listing all former SS members would soon become a list of honor. Joachim Piper, one of the most prominent officers of the 1st Division of the Waffen-SS, was Joachim Piper, whose end was curious and unclear. After his release, Piper led a discreet life and did not publicly associate with former members of the Nazi Party. However, in private, he remained a staunch believer and member of the secret community of the Waffen-SS in the Federal Republic of Germany. The Mutual Aid Association of former members of the Waffen-SS and the SS provided him with support to find employment, initially at Porsche in Stuttgart, but he was fired due to his actions during the war. The community helped him again to get a job as a car salesman at Volkswagen. In June 1964, Piper was tried in Stuttgart for the Boves massacre of September 1943. Despite the collective guilt of the combat group, the court determined that there was no evidence of Joachim Piper's individual responsibility or that he had directly ordered the massacre. He was acquitted of all charges after the trial. In an interview in 1967, he expressed his National Socialist sentiments and his discontent with contemporary Germany, mentioning his desire to move to France despite not feeling a particular affinity for the French due to his love for the country and his disdain for German materialism. In 1972, Joachim Piper and his wife Sigrid decided to move to Travis, in Burgundy, France. They chose a small house on the outskirts of the village. Although the French authorities knew who Piper was, they granted him a temporary 5-year residence permit. While living in France, he worked as a translator of military history books. He seemed to lead a quiet life and did not go out much. In 1974, a former member of the French resistance, Paul Cassot, believed he recognized Piper in a store. Although unsure, he reported his possible presence to the French Communist Party. In 1976, Cassot contacted Pierre Durin, a historian who confirmed Piper's identity in the Stasi archives. On June 21, 1976, anti-Nazi activists distributed leaflets in Travis informing people that Piper was a war criminal. On June 22, an article by Lee Manite confirmed his presence, beginning a campaign that called for his expulsion. On July 13th, Piper advised his wife to return to Germany, hoping the situation would improve. However, in the early morning of July 14th, police received calls alerting them to a fire in Piper's house. When firefighters arrived, they found the house in flames and a severely burned body inside, reduced to about 60 centimeters due to the fire's intense heat. Reintegration into civilian life in post-war Germany. Veterans of the Waffen-SS played an important role in efforts to rehabilitate the reputation of the Waffen-SS, which had committed numerous war crimes during World War II. High-ranking German politicians courted former members of the Waffen-SS and their veterans organization, HIAG. Controversially, some veterans served in the new German armed forces, the Bundeswehr. In addition, leaders of the Waffen-SS during the war, such as Paul Hauser and Kurt Meyer, published several revisionist or uncritical books about the Waffen-SS in the post-war years. HIAG exerted some political influence in West Germany and tried to attract the majority parties, but this changed in the 1960s when the Veterans Organization, having achieved its objectives, turned to far-right politics. HIAG greatly exaggerated its influence and at no time represented more than 8% of all Waffen-SS veterans in West Germany. In Germany, the historical revision of the impact of Waffen-SS veterans on post-war German society is still ongoing, and in recent years several books have been published on the subject. The issue of Waffen-SS veterans in West German society reached a critical point when the country began to rearm and the Bundeswehr was formed in 1955. Initially, the intention was not to admit any former members of the SS, but this soon changed to allow former members up to the rank of Obersturmbannführer, lieutenant colonel. Public opinion was divided on this, as many people in Germany had also suffered under the Nazi regime, while many others have been voluntary or involuntary members of Nazi organizations, such as the SS. The exclusion of former SS members was criticized by HIAG, which attempted to establish a distinction between the honorable Waffen-SS and the evil SS, despite the fact that up to 60,000 men of the Waffen-SS also served in concentration and extermination camps. The admission of former members of the Waffen-SS into the new Bundeswehr created some unease among the former Allied powers, Great Britain, France, and the United States. West Germany received conditional approval from the United States Department of State for the admission of former members of the Waffen-SS into the armed forces, provided that the number of applications was small and the selection process careful. This position was clarified after a question from the American Jewish Committee about how this measure would affect the democratic character of the new German armed forces. From a German side, rejecting former members of the Waffen-SS was considered politically dangerous, since the 500,000 veterans of the Waffen-SS, a figure later considered too high, constituted too large a group to ignore as potential voters. The veterans of the Waffen-SS were courted not only by West Germany. The leader of the conservative opposition, Kurt Schumacher, also maintained good relations with the organization. The number of applications from former members of the Waffen-SS to join the new Bundeswehr remained low, with 3,117 applications received until September 1956, of which 508 were accepted, including 33 officers, despite the promised selection process. At least one member of the Waffen-SS, Major Ulrich Boss, who had been a guard at the Binzau concentration camp, was approved. In total, the number of former members of the Waffen-SS in the Bundeswehr never exceeded 770. In comparison, the same selection process was not applied to the Federal Criminal Police Office, where 33 of the 57 senior officials were former members of the SS. In post-war Germany, several former members of the Waffen-SS were successful in adopting various approaches to revealing their past. Günter Grass, awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1999, admitted in 2006 that he joined the SS in 1944. Actor Hardy Kruger was recruited by the Waffen-SS in 1945 and admitted his past by refusing to shoot at American troops. Another prominent German actor, Horst Tappert, kept his past a secret, and it was only 5 years after his death that his service in the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf since 1942 was revealed. East German painter Ben H. Heisig, who volunteered for the SS in 1942, admitted his past and joined the Communist Party after the war. Journalist and Waffen-SS volunteer Franz Skonhuber worked for 35 years for Bavarian newspapers and for state television Bayerischer Rundfunk before being fired for downplaying Nazi crimes in his autobiography, after which he moved to far-right politics with moderate success.